Welcome. How should we study the relationship between religions and the environment? One method is to ask what any given tradition says about the natural order. Here, we might look at what a particular scripture says, or how key rituals make use of natural objects. But we might also begin not with belief, but behavior. Here, we could look at a particular community, studying what its practices are. And because religions contain multitudes, we would study many communities before reaching any conclusions. So, today, we'll do three things. First, we'll look at how the environment became a widespread concept. Then, we'll look at how engrams give us a clearer sense of important shifts in terminology. Finally, we'll unpack some questions of method. That is, we'll step back and look at what's at stake in privileging either belief or behavior. We need to start with a somewhat philosophical question. Which comes first, belief or behavior? In responding to this question, many of us probably have what you might call a cognitive bias. We assume that our ideas, that is, our perceptions of the world and our beliefs about it, come first. And, ideally, our actions then follow. But why do we privilege belief? There are various historical explanations for why we do so. For example, maybe it's due to the historic Protestant emphasis on faith over works. Or maybe it's due to someone like René Descartes, who is well known for saying, "I think, therefore I am." Both of these privilege, in their own ways, the interior aspects of human experience over the exterior aspects. And we often do the same, whether we realize it or not. For example, we've often heard people say, "Practice what you preach." And we probably agree with this sentiment. But is this the same as saying, "Preach what you practice"? Granted, both statements point to a disconnect between belief and behavior. But the first statement emphasizes belief shaping behavior, whereas the latter statement emphasizes behavior shaping belief. Of course, it might not be just one or the other. It's probably a bit of both, with variation across time and space. Nonetheless, how we think about the relationship between belief and behavior will influence how we study the relationship between the wider natural world and any, indeed every, belief system, whether religious, political, or some mixture thereof. Lynn White's 1967 article is the starting point for pretty much any study on religion and the environment. But, notably, he never used one important word in his article. That is, he never used the word environment. He wrote of an ecologic crisis rather than an environmental one. So, when did environment become the common term for thinking about the wider natural world? And what does this tell us about the historical intersections of religious and environmental thought and action? To answer these questions, we have to go back to the 19th century. Originally, environment denoted the social context in which people develop. It wasn't a term that referred to nature, and, to some extent, environment has retained this earlier meaning. We still talk about social environments. But by the mid-20th century, people had begun to consider the wider natural order as part of that social environment. That is, nature was increasingly seen as part of the context in which we live, and therefore part of the context that shapes us as individuals. When ecologists in the early 20th century began using the word environment, they did so by describing it as part of a larger interlocking system. So, here was an ecological turn in the meaning of environment. And This proved crucial for later usage. But even with this shift, we haven't got to a point when environment denotes all of nature. An important turn took place in 1948 with the creation of the IUPN, that is, the International Union for the Protection of Nature. It was created by UNESCO, that is, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. In their mission statement, IUPN wrote, "The term protection of nature may be defined as the preservation of the entire world biotic community, or man's natural environment, which includes the Earth's renewable natural resources, of which it is composed, and the foundation of human civilization." This was different than older conservation organizations, which had long existed but tended to focus on particular matters in particular locales. Here was an organization concerned with nature itself, which they described as the natural environment. And because the product of the United Nations, then and now the world's largest international political organization, the IUPN drew together specialists from a wide variety of academic disciplines and from all over the world. Consequently, its view of the environment as the whole of nature slowly but surely reached every corner of the globe. And during these same decades, the ecological emphasis on interlocking systems became a defining feature of environmental thought. One way of charting the popularity of any term is to look at an engram of that term. An engram is a quantitative visualization of printed words. The N in engram stands for the number of words that you're researching. In this case, we're just looking at one word, so our engram is a unigram. An engram of 2 words is called a bigram. An engram of 3 words is called a trigram. You get the idea. The potential data set for an engram is a corpus of texts. In this case, we're going to use Google's Ngram Creator. Google uses for its corpus the digitized holdings of Google Books. At the time of this recording, Google Books contained more than 40 million books in over 500 languages. The x-axis on the engram is time, and the y-axis is the engram as a percentage of the total number of words in the corpus for that year. Here is the engram of environment. As we can see, it grew slowly in popularity between the late 19th century and the mid-1940s, and from there it grew more rapidly, and then it took off in the 1960s. Now, as with all data, there are limits with what we see here. First, Google's Ngram generator is chronologically delimited. It begins in 1800 and, at present, ends in 2019. Second, the word environment is English. Consequently, our engram only displays uses of the English word. You can search in multiple languages, but here I want to keep things simple. So, the takeaway is this: environment rapidly grew in usage during the 1960s. Even with slight later declines, its popularity remains far greater today than ever before. In his 1989 work, The Rights of Nature, A History of Environmental Ethics, author Roderick Nash included a chapter entitled The Greening of Religion. Nash began his chapter with a lengthy discussion of the Lynn White thesis, but he then went on to survey Christian theologians, both before and after White, who articulated a concern for the environment. He also noted the development of a new theological term, eco-theology, and we see this here in a Google Ngram of the same term. Eco-theology first appeared in the late 1970s, but only grew in popularity quite rapidly in the 1980s. Nash concluded that, during this decade, increasing numbers took it for granted that the human-nature relationship could not be excluded from the ethics of religious individuals. Eco-theology had not only become a new word, but a compelling worldview. Since Nash's work, a variety of scholars have also studied the relationship between environmental concern and religious commitment. Usually, by using Nash's own phrase, the greening of religion. But of course, belief and behavior are not the same, and this returns us to our earlier question: how should we study religious approaches to the environment? Consider this meta-analysis from 2016, which analyzed more than 700 articles. In their conclusion, the authors expressed skepticism towards Nash's greening of religion hypothesis. In their words, extant research indicates that White's critique continues to have explanatory power. Christians may agree with statements that they should be good environmental stewards, but such concerns are often obviated by other variables. This may be because environmental concerns are, at best, for most, a low priority. This last sentence is key. The most here is not just religious individuals. More than once in recent years, a city government has been exposed for having a fraudulent recycling program in which recyclables were simply discarded in landfills along with all other trash. And this is true of cities regardless of where the population's majority falls on the American political spectrum. But it's also the case that action and concern might precede belief. There's a fascinating study entitled Faith, Hope, and Sustainability: The Greening of U.S. Faith Communities. The author, Sybil Shattuck, studied 15 religious congregations across the United States. She found that, in fact, environmental stewardship usually comes from what she calls triggers for sustainability initiatives. There are 5: faith leaders, environmental threats, career-related projects, the discernment of the religious community, and finally, an opportunity presented by an external organization. Notably, it's the last of these that has its locus of leadership outside of the faith community. Shattuck shows that a community's motivation usually comes from within, and, in some instances, concerns are motivated by more basic values, such as the desire to be a good neighbor. These then lead to further environmental reflection. Belief then develops in a more environmental direction. More simply stated, pro-environmental beliefs are sometimes the outcome rather than the initial cause of community engagement. Sometimes behavior comes first and belief follows. It's desirable that we practice what we preach, but it's no less desirable that we also preach what we practice. So what? So let's back up a bit. If the foregoing is at all correct, then by the late 1960s, we were not only given new ways of viewing the Earth, but new ways of describing Earth as an interconnected system. We now call this the environment. All of this probably amounted to a paradigm shift for those then living, although we, today, are the heirs of that shift. And this is true of all of us, of whatever religion or none. And this means that, even if some deny the import of one or another environmental issue, no one denies that the environment itself is a real thing. In other words, the terms of the debate have been set, and they're unlikely to change, even if particular issues are sometimes debated within that shared framework. Does belief impact behavior? Of course it does. I would hope that no one would deny this. But if we want to better understand why people do what they do, and how religion shapes those actions, we have to do much more than simply survey attitudes. We have to look at life on the ground, where religious individuals are part of larger religious communities, because that is where those same communities live as part of the larger environment. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. First, The Greening of Religion Hypothesis received early extended treatment in Roderick Nash, The Rights of Nature, A History of Environmental Ethics. It's a classic work still in print after more than 3 decades. Second, and as I've noted, the environment is a fairly recent concept. Its development after World War II is expertly detailed. in the Environment, A History of the Idea by Paul Ward, Libby Robin, and Sverker Solin. Finally, research on the greening of religion hypothesis continues apace. I'm especially impressed with the approach taken by Sybil Shattuck in her work, Faith, Hope, and Sustainability, the Greening of U.S. Faith Communities. It's a detailed ethnographic study of how particular communities engage environmental matters. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.